Um, I wonder if you let me have a speech today that's slightly different to what you normally get at these sort of places. And if I could just open with that slide, to just to indicate this is going to be a bit different. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see it's a lift. Now, not this particular lift, but a lift very similar to that. In fact, is set to change the nation. And it's very important to look at that lift and say, what on earth would happen to this country in that lift that might change the nation? And there we go to the next slide. It's just not the lift itself that changed the nation, it's who was in it. And you'll see two men there. And we wouldn't have known about this lift ride except that John Seeker he did it on television, and he described the lift ride. Only two people in the lift. And he said something, according to John, that made Albanese very, very unhappy. So this was a dramatic lift ride because the CFMEU boss said something to Albanese that made him extraordinarily unhappy. And as you'll see later, it was to have tremendous ramifications. What did he say? Because he didn't tell us, you see. But if you read the papers before that, it actually there's press reports that tell you what he must have said. And that was that the CFMEU had done its job on the work front, but was now moving to its next stage. And that was to take control of the ALP via the branches. And they would put in members in each of the key branches and take control. But this has all been publicised, it was well documented, that was the plan. But Seeker told Albanese that. Now, I wonder what Albanese would be thinking next. You don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar. We have all known that the industrial relations, the work sites were drug distribution operations, and that organised crime was all part of that exercise. Was no secret about it, but you couldn't write that stuff because A, you might get shot, but B, it was a very you got to prove it, and you'll get sued to unless you start write that sort of stuff. If I say you're part of organised crime or you're part of organised crime, I'd better be right, or I better have very good documentation. So it wasn't written. Suddenly, all the newspapers and all the media organisations, the television, the radio, were starting to run this stuff. Now, the people who knew and could prove it were, of course, the unions themselves and the ALP. They knew exactly where their money was coming from. And out it all came. I wasn't part of all that. I don't know who told the journalists what. I'm guessing. But it was not a bad guess because, to write that sort of stuff with that sort of confidence, you had to be very clear that you had your sources right. And no good journalists writing that, they would not have written that stuff unless their sources were right. So I take it back to the lift. And remember, why does this change the nation, or why could it change the nation? Because that's where the bulk of the money for the ALP and campaigns has been coming from. It's always come from the unions. And of course, the richest unions put the most money in, and that's the CFMEU. It was a very big step. That means the next election, Michael and his team have a better chance because there's more money, less money coming from that source. Now, the next slide takes you back to 1948. Now, why on earth would I go back to 1948? It happens to be Melbourne. That's what happened. What happened in 1948 that gave us a lesson as to what should have happened this time but didn't? Does anyone know? Well, no. Chifley, you got that part right, yes. Chifley was about to nationalise the banks. And that was the key issue in the 1949 election. Prior to the election, though, in 1948, there was a protest march down, I think it was Collins Street, but one of the streets of Melbourne. And guess who led the charge? Who led the protest? Physically, there. The CEO of the National Bank. In other words, that he was prepared to go down the street in Collins Street. Why? Because he was going to lose control of his bank, as of course the other banks as well. Now, 75 years later, a similar proposal was put forward, not for government control, but the sharing of control of the management of major corporations around the country, not just banks. And that is the essence of the industrial relations legislation. You can say, oh, there's that bit there and that bit there and that bit there. But the essence of it is that you have shared management control. And the union delegates are very much part of that, because if you don't put your committees in and do things like that, oh, you've got your shift allowances wrong, you've got that wrong, you've got that wrong. The union delegate will be trained to pick those things up. And it's carefully, this is about union control. And in our mining sector, we had a situation where there was shared union control for most of our mines. Exceptions, yes, but most of that was the case. That's changed, and the productivity went up. Now, this was legislation that took that back. This was the equivalent of Chifley in 48. And the companies involved absolutely shut their mouths. They didn't say no. Unbelievable. Now, when it's all in, it's passed and all that sort of stuff, oh, what a terrible thing it is. Well, I'm sorry, fellas. Take your medicine, because you caused that. You didn't come up and state what your situation was. I'm not sure it would have changed the situation, but there's a real lesson for this for the current coalition. And I've written all this stuff, and whether they'll actually listen, I don't know. It doesn't matter. But you can't. It's extremely difficult for a political party on its own to change the nature of the situation unless it has complete power over the Houses of Parliament. And changing the industrial relations legislation, and I'll have to think of a word other than reform, changing that will require the participants to actually begin the campaign. So BHP started that. Of course, they would have been very helpful if they'd done a bit earlier. Interestingly, we had Rio on the stage the other day at the Melbourne Mining Club, and when asked this question, he dodged it. They obviously think they are better to keep their mouth shut and do it that exercise that way. But here you have what I'm saying to the coalition is, don't go to this next polls with a whole series of industrial relations changes. Only one industrial relations change, casual labour, because that hits the worker. And then, of course, you have a conference and you tell people, we're going to look at this, we're going to invite workers. Yes, we'll invite unions too, and we'll invite corporations. We'll invite everybody to look at this thing, say 6 to 12 months after we've got the power, and then we'll make the changes. You see, if you go the other way before the community has been brought forward, you will simply get all your entitlements are going to go. Our community out there has been hit hardly, and now a coalition is going to come in and make it worse. Unless the industrial relations legislation is linked to this prosperity, and that's all linked together, and it hasn't been, and no one's been affected by it yet. So you can't. Very, very dangerous game to be playing that game when the companies haven't gone out and set the ground. And maybe you could do that in 2 years' time, but not in May next year. So that's me on industrial relations. It's a very dangerous situation. But let me take you to the next one. Oh yes. This is a bit of a problem with our companies. They're not all of them, but a number of them have become woke. And I actually, if you, at quiet moments when you talk to some of the directors who are non-woke directors on these boards, they say, we've got to be bored. We didn't realise they were all woke. It's quite dangerous for shareholders, for all groups in these companies. I picked these two out, probably quite unfairly, but they were the most prominent in the referendum. Woolworths, goodness me, there is a monopoly situation, not quite with Coles and Woolworths, very strong position in the marketplace, and they go out there and they put their money on the government against an opposition battle. Why? Because the board you look at the board, it's dominated by people who with gender issues. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it's unfortunate the whole board gets that way. Gay rights, Aborigines, not thinking about the fact that 60% of their customers have a different view. When it came to milk, the National Party went to them some many years ago and said, please, you're wiping out all our dairy farmers by this policy. Would you please just save some of the industry? And they told them, jump. Just jump straight in the lake. We're going to kill them off. And they did. There's a festering there, and you've got an opposition party where that festers. And then you decide to put the money on the other side. And then you have Gina Gottliebsen, who, whether you like Gina or don't like Gina, when it comes to detail, we saw in Qantas, it's extremely good. There is if the coalition gets the power, there's a fairly good chance that Woolworths get broken up, as will Coles too. And it'll be the board's fault. They did this. Go across to Qantas. They're going to get a lot more international competition. And we may well see in the end that Qantas will become a domestic carrier, the old TAA, Australian Airlines, it was called then. And just the national area will be a higher priced prestige long haul. We will travel from Melbourne to New York uninterrupted, a different sort of aircraft. The other airlines probably won't put those aircraft into their fleet because they're only specialised for Australia and long distances. And we may get a very different, and Qantas themselves, as a woke board, have not really thought about the issues that are facing their company. I think they are now, but they're only just beginning to get to that stage. And they had to be a lot more astute as to how they handled that situation. And this goes across, and we talk about, these companies become woke because the influence of the big institutions, not just industry funds, by the way, retail funds as well. And guess what Australia's pretty good at? Networking small shareholders. We're one of the world leaders in this area. And these companies couldn't be bothered and interfere with our wokeness because the ordinary shareholders were in that 60%. Companies that thought about this would start to be developing their non-institutional shareholders. Of course, they're going to look after their institutional shareholders. They've got to do that. But what a good idea it would be to come closer to their non-institutional shareholders, like self-managed funds. But not just that. And we are leading the world in that sort of activity in medium-sized companies and smaller companies, not in larger companies. And that will come. They will wake up in the end. But it's hard work. Oh, look. If you're going to run a slide on tax, what do you think you'd put up there? I just have a think. But I thought there's only one thing to do when you're going to write a piece on tax. Now, the thing about it is that Mussolini had a lot of problems, but one of them was he couldn't get the Italians to pay tax, and he really had a lot of trouble in this area. And and here I'm being absolutely politically, this is a Labor and a coalition problem that doesn't change. It's nothing to do with politics. Not quite, anyway. Um, an increasing part of our non-mining community is being dedicated and being taken over by people who, Italian type people with Mussolini. We don't pay tax. It's not part of their what they do. We know the companies: Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, Google, Meta, and so on. And look at Telstra's operation. They've got a huge slice of what was once Telstra. Telstra pays tax, they don't. And you're going to see these companies everywhere. Artificial intelligence or enhanced computer capacity will increase it. And so this is a global problem, not just Australia. The growth areas of our marketplace, or a big growth area of our marketplace, is now being occupied by non-taxpayers. And the Australian companies who sometimes compete with them do pay tax. So if Telstra wanted to get into these big artificial intelligence computers, because they probably should have done anyway, but they didn't, they can't do that because they've got to pay tax. The other guys don't. Telstra has the wires from those big centres, and they go, but one day those companies might say, well, why don't we do that? We've got a 30% advantage. We can kill them off. Amazon, you watch them. You're worrying about Woolworths and Coles or those sort of companies, but other retailers are worried about whatever they worry about, their wokeness. Watch Amazon. Watch Amazon. They are extremely skilled. And you know what? One of the fascinating parts of the industrial relations legislation was the Amazon clause. No other country in the world would put into their, we'll call it reform, okay, just for the fun of it, into their reforms in industrial relations, an Amazon clause to help a particular company. And they did it. Now, does anyone not know how the Amazon clause works? Okay, don't put your hand up, it's all right. The key part of the industrial legislation, very clear, nice and easy to understand, was to increase the cost of general transport at least 10%, perhaps 20%. And we do that legislatively by getting rid of all the efficient, independent, and safe, the most safest drivers of like it's their truck, truckies, and replace that with a cartel between the union and the large corporation. The best estimate I got is that puts the costs up 10%. Now, the guy was telling me about it, he was very much in the paying business, he knows about it, and the operating business. He said it could be more than that. Now, this is transport of goods by road, up 10 to 20%. Now, the Amazon clause means that you can run an efficient transport business, kill your competitors by 10 to 20% by using the Amazon clause. And what's the Amazon clause? If you take the goods from a warehouse or a factory or anything you like and transport it direct to a household, not to some other store or anything like that, you take it to a household, then you can use the efficient transport system, the old one, and it costs 10 to 20% less. That's the Amazon, and that's what Amazon do. Think of the poor old post office. It's stupid people. Someone goes to companies and some of it goes to households. They don't divide their stuff up between households and companies. So Amazon clause designed to protect that huge company and pay no tax. Now, any other company can participate in it, but I know one company, a company you all know about. And what it does is that with smaller things, rather than send their stuff to a store, they just go straight from the supplier to the household. And you'll see much more of that coming through. So, tax. Let me just talk about tax on Australia. By the way, just before we leave it, this is a world problem. an increasing area of the non-mining community is being occupied by people who don't pack their packs. It's called the leprechaun sandwich. And that is, they've changed the Irish rules a bit, but if you're really in there, you're okay. It's a beautiful sandwich, it is too. You only pay a small amount of tax. And we have actually done, poor old Chris Jordan, I have a hard time with him, but he actually tried very hard to fix this and he couldn't do it. That's it. Now, I'm getting close, am I? Just a few words about the Australian Tax Office, though, and the way it persecutes Australian companies. Let me just tell you a little story, true story. Once upon a time, there was a tax office, and it made a hell of a very bad mistake. Billions of dollars of GST money was lost by a mistake, a bad administration by the tax office. Most of those billions, by the way, ended up at Hamas or Zanzibar, just by its interest. We've got a big stake in that because we funded a lot of them in the early stages. We think that it went to the Middle East anyway. We think that's where it went. This is a stolen money. This is in the gold business. This is gold GST fraud. My God, I'm in the tax office. Oh, I've lost all this money. I've got to conceal it. How am I going to do that? Oh, someone come up with a great idea. We'll issue a whole series of fictitious tax assessments to as many gold refiners as we can in the attempt to bankrupt the lot. And they did it. And they made one mistake. One of the gold refiners survived and had money and took them to court. And we went up the court process, all the nonsense went on high court and all that sort of stuff. I lost a lot, every case. And it came out in the court case that these were fictitious assessments. And when you get an assessment, you're liable for it. The money, the rumour gets leaked to the bank pulls your credit, and you're broke. Because it's a lot, and you're guilty before the presumption of guilt starts with tax. So the tax office did this, and it's still one more case to go at the High Court. They've spent millions on their defence and lost every case. I'm sorry, they won one, and then went back and went to the next court, got thrown out, and then back. But so we have a tax office that sometimes operates very well, and does handle a thing quite well, but it has a ruthless streak that is extraordinarily dangerous, and a system that's totally unfair because it is based on the French system of justice where you're guilty. Here's your assessment. You're liable for it. I won't tell you the details. You're going to work that out, and then you're going to tell me I'm wrong. It's not the way you run a proper tax system. I just finally say on tax, before I go to the next subject, I think we're going to have to look at a different tax system in terms of corporations. And we will need to look, I think, at a system based on cash flow, a different system of tax that was originally suggested by John Ralph, and it was also then suggested by actually a group of people which included the industry fund representative. And I think that's going to happen globally. Very interestingly, in the Trump proposal, I'm not into Trump-Harris stuff, but in the Trump proposal, by putting a tariff on it, you actually are taxing these companies like a GST. I know that's only an import, but they're very based on imports, and then you lower the tax rate. You in fact are tackling the beginning of the problem because the Americans get affected by the leprechaun sandwich as well. That's an issue that's got to be tackled by both our parties, I think. This is a national issue that we can't have so much of our economy being dominated by non-taxpayers. And you aren't going to fix it just by the current system. You're going to have to look at a very different system. And we haven't started that debate yet. Oh, yes, that's right. Energy. Actually, quite a bit of energy has been talked about today. But how would you get Victoria out of the problem? What is the biggest undeveloped asset Victoria has? Gas. Now, it does require 6 more holes, maybe 7, probably 30 million expenditure. Coalition has not played it well in Victoria. They haven't. Napthine rejected this thing first of all. It does have to be. You do have to do some more work on it to make sure that it's there and it will flow. And it's the cleanest gas in the world because as it's dissolved in water, it's very deep. You can grow plants and absorb a lot of the carbon. And look, Michael talked about this, and others have talked about it. You've got to look at the whole situation. And what I'd like to alert you to is where a lot of confusion arises. Politician or public servant or media person says, this form of energy is cheapest of all. This form is that. And usually the difference comes in the amortization of the capital investment. And so when you've got wind and solar, of course, the actual production is nil. But you've got to add the amortization of the short time that the solar panels and the windmills live, including the wires, and then the backup. And if you're looking at the cost of that particular non-carbon energy source, you must look at all the different components. And of course, the politicians don't necessarily do that. Similarly with nuclear, you must look at the essence of it is how long do you amortize the power station. So if you actually amortize that nuclear power station over 20 years, my goodness me, it will be very costly. You've got to do it a much longer period. It may not be possible to get to the Victorian gas, in which case we may look at Beetaloo gas. And again, the cost of the Beetaloo gas. This is, I'm sorry to those who might know, this is the most enormous gas deposit in Northern Territory. And you've got to, there's got to run a pipeline 900 k's to the Moomba area, and then it gets into the national grid. Now, the cost of that gas will be determined, of course, by the price and all the things you know about, but the big cost is how long the time you amortize the pipeline. Now, if you amortize the pipeline over 60 years or 50 years, it'll last that long, then it's cheap. Now, but will you take gas in 60 years? Like, very interesting, different problem. That's the key to it. So if you see somebody talk about the pricing of energy, any sort, always ask them the next set of questions. And by the way, that's not done in our business. It's and the CSIRO came up with that report saying nuclear is too costly. Well, it's humbug. As far as I can tell, the most expensive energy you can ever have is offshore wind. Offshore wind is just the most disastrous you could ever think of. Guess who's going to do it? Don't tell anyone. There's one here. And why? Because of the enormity of the cost. And it was interesting in the papers this morning. A group called Evolution came up and said, "Do you realise what happens here is that the state, whether it be Victoria or New South Wales, this lady's the leader of the Victorian energy thing, they say, oh, well, we'll pay you so much money for your energy." Well, what happens, of course, is it's a huge price that's paid. The company itself, it doesn't take a risk. It's take or pay, and they make a lot of money. And so the cost of this offshore energy is in what you pay for the future power. And guess who thinks it's a marvelous idea? The companies that want to put it in, because they're going to make a fortune. It's a take or pay job. They will amortise they know their costs extremely well, and they say, well, let's say the costs are 100 units, and Victoria or New South Wales is in it too. Oh, we'll pay you 150 units. And you've got a take or pay contract with a certain profit. And so the cost is confused because it is what someone's going to pay for the future. It's the future, any sort of government. You're committed to it. So this lady here is absolutely dedicated not to develop gas. And I'll finish today with what I still believe is one of the most remarkable stories in our country. Here was a state that had this, what the Americans say is a very big gas deposit. Sure, it's deep and it's dissolved in water, and sure, it needs some more drilling to fish it out. It was a deposit that, when I first started to write about it, I got yeso. Just gave me I had time. I'd written that I got planning to spend $100 million on it. And he says, you got it wrong. Yeso is telling me this. It was $200 million. And BlueScope was in it too. But we did go to Napline first and he knocked it back. So how do we neutralise this gas deposit in the media, the gullible media, and other parts of the community? How can we do that? I'm Daniel, but actually I think it was her. I think it was Lily. But because it's kept going after Daniel left, you see. That's how you know he was doing what he was told, I think. So we'll form a committee. And this committee will have the job of determining whether there's any onshore gas in Victoria that doesn't require fracking. Just not any gas in Victoria. 42 million for the trouser. 42 million went into the committee to make this very big determination. Daniel, in the middle of the night, drew a map of Victoria, and he left out, he cast out where this gas was and a little bit in Warrnambool as well. And so the committee was told, to get your 42 million, you must not look in those areas. And they didn't. I remember ringing him up. I said, you said there's no gas in Victoria. What about that gas over? Oh, no, we weren't allowed to look there. And we weren't allowed to look there. So then from then on, Daniel and Lily could say, we've got the experts saying there's no gas in Victoria. Don't you worry about that. And of course, you know the story. And that's energy policy. You can see there's a lot of work to be done in these areas. And it does require to bring the population with us. And there is a problem with in our business, our total media business, very often, irrespective of which party's in power, the individual people who are writing about this stuff get very close to the particular organisation. Like it could be the public service, it could be an organisation, or whatever it might be. And they tend to run that line. And that certainly affected us in energy, no question about that. And so there is a problem in the media, whole media as well. So there's a lot of work to be done. But a great place to write about. I'm enjoying myself. Thank you.